In this part, we're gonna talk more about the textbook stuff. How does it all begin? How do you even start to conceptualize and plan a textbook?
So, what a kind question. I think in one of the editions of Ettinger's, the preface has a sentence that I have never forgotten because I've never forgotten. It says, "It is not enough for you to think you have a good idea. Somebody else has to think so too." And so, right, like you can think of, like I remember thinking, like, oh, this is nice, but like reading something, what if it looked like this, or what if it contained that? And so those kinds of ideas, when they start to come together, are great, but they'll go nowhere unless somebody else thinks that that's worthwhile. So for me, my first adventure in formal textbook publication, because like you, I published some things on my own, just copyrighted to myself, self-published. Uh, but my first real adventure was the clinical veterinary advisor. And that just turned out to be that the publisher, Elsevier, was looking to create a veterinary version of a textbook called The Clinical Advisor, which has been around for decades.
Oh,
And so it was a derivative in the same way that the 5 Minute Veterinary Consult was a spin off of the 5 Minute Consult.
interesting. I
Uh,
didn't know that.
and so that was in the early 2000s. And they approached my former boss, Bettinger, and said, "Can you do this?" And he said, "Can't, because I'm too busy with my own textbook." But he said, "There's a young guy who I think you might ask." So they asked me, and so it was thanks to him that that connection started. Um, and then I guess what happened was that it just worked. Um, yeah. So recruitment, so identifying different people who might be like really good section editors, and then they identified people who would be really good contributors for others. That was the process, really, step by step. Just like we tell the students on a physical exam. If you think like figuring out why an animal's sick is just like that, it's not.
Hmm, interesting. So it begins kind of with the publisher, like they come to you, they have a framework, and then you find the section editors.
So it can. In that case, it did because they were interested in creating this book as an offshoot of their human book. I think actually it's more often the case that individuals have an idea for a book. And so we approach the publisher saying,
Hmm,
"Are you interested?"
interesting. And so, how did the veterinary board games, the flashcards, these things happen?
So that was great. It's a fantastic story where a former student, when I think he'd been a veterinarian for 1 year, maybe two at that point, he said to me one day, "Why are there no trivia games to help study for boards?"
Hmm.
And this was in about 2010 or 11. So the advisor, I had some experience with publishing at that. And he said that, and I thought, I said, "I don't know, but if you want to do this, I'll do it with you." And he said, "Okay." So I approached Elsevier. I said, "Hey, we have this idea, a board game that we'll call as a play on words, right? It's the board exam, so we'll call it veterinary board games." It's also a board game. And they said, "That sounds great, but we don't do games. Sorry." So like 100% rejection. And so then we said, "Well, then why don't we do it ourselves?" And so that's really interesting because that's a small business. We had to figure out how to do like the financial aspect. We had to find a graphic designer who could help with the color scheme and laying things out. Find a printer who makes board games. It turns out there was one just in the province of Quebec, so even in Canada, that's all they did. And so all of those, and then recruiting the contributors. So there's 66 members of like my connections here at ABC and former students and my collaborators, James and Julia's folks. We basically asked all our friends to write 10 questions, and then we wrote a whole bunch as well. and so that's how it came together. And it's a bittersweet thing in this moment because you were asking earlier about what to be proud of. I'm so proud to have been able to create something like that with former students. And so there's a small moment of sadness here because just 3 months ago, at the age of 46, he suddenly passed away. And so I mentioned, in respect and gratitude, all that he did. It was his idea to do that just as a creative student.
That's so interesting because Chandler just recently wrote her BCSE exam, and she really loved those flashcards.
Oh, nice.
I also used them when I was studying for NAVLE, so they're neat. So at this point, you've got you're the editor in chief of Ettinger's clinical veterinary advisor, feline cardiology, um, the clinical skill.
Right.
And what else? How would it take
Yeah,
so much
some
time?
of the board games, but those are no human could do that properly all at the same time, right? Feeling cardiology lives on as a single edition, but it's not in print anymore. So that's in the past. Clinical veterinary advisor, I approached my colleague Leah Cohn, who's the interim dean or immediate past interim dean of the College of Veterinary Medicine at the University of Missouri, and the internist. I mean, a brilliant person and a dear friend. And I approached her 7 years back and asked if she would want to become the editor in chief of the advisor, and she said yes. And I'm grateful. So really, out of all of that stuff now, what I'm involved in is really purely interest.
Okay. So you said like clinical veterinary advisor anymore?
No, so it's called Côté's Clinical Veterinary Advisor, which is a big honor. But I'm not involved in editing or printing.
Okay, for the next
Right.
edition.
And the past edition was the handoff edition. It's really what we see today is the hard work of Leah Coleman and the editors and authors.
Interesting. How do you go about picking contributors and authors for the different chapters, and what are the qualities do you look for in a good contributor?
Yeah, that's such a great question. So, here again, I got very lucky to benefit from the wisdom of Steve Ettinger. One thing I learned is that sometimes the people who are most famous are also the most committed.
Mhm.
I mean, does it mean that because they're very busy, they can do a lot? Or is it they're very busy, but they're overcommitted and they'll say yes out of kindness, but not be able to actually finish the deal? So I think that the things I'll say that we look for. So Steve Ettinger, Ed Feldman, and I, when I think of the last two editions of Ettinger's, no question about it, an expert in the field. But it doesn't have to be somebody who is at the foremost, because otherwise, how do you rejuvenate the author population? So somebody who's shown great promise, uh, who has written articles and published peer review articles, even though their program didn't require them to. Somebody who's in private practice, whose days are long and yet who still manages to yes participate in large clinical trials or publishes peer reviewed papers. Those are really one thing I learned from one of our interns this year, Dr. Hadkan, is to be very careful about choosing authors who are not simply repeating what they have already written in other textbooks. Because a reader, when they pick something up, they're happy to see that there's a new, fresh perspective on a topic, not just the same thing that perhaps has already been written in another book.
Interesting. So, how do you handle coordinating multiple authors and contributors, especially when they're scattered all over the world and um, uh, different time zones?
I think this is very similar to client communication. It was surprising to me. I should have expected it, but I didn't initially with the advisor. How much interpersonal connections matters compared to. I thought that a textbook was 100% intellectual knowledge of veterinary facts.
Mhm.
And I came to discover that it's a blend of that and interpersonal. Uh, some people appreciate being reminded, others consider it pushy. Some people appreciate having an editor's feedback for things that can change. Others consider that to be unwanted. And so I think figuring out where somebody is at, like clients, understanding and listening to the perspective so that we can get an interaction that works well. That is how it works. Because, I mean, it's all, email or text nowadays. And so the actual act of communicating is quite straightforward. It's more, how does this become a priority over the 1 million other things that this author has their response?
So, how many people are they for the last edition of I think yours the ninth one? How many contributors?
Yeah. I want to say 316, but
Wow.
that might have been an initial list and it could have changed a little bit, but it's a little bit over 300. Yeah.
And is it? Do you divide people between yourselves, or you just contact the section editors?
Right. So it's the kind of pyramid approach where there's editors in chief, section editors, and authors is something that we did this edition. The last edition of Editors was the first time we tried that. And it's been the way the advisor has worked since the beginning, the first edition. It acknowledges that no one person or between Steve, Ed, and me, no three people can fully know the breadth of veterinary medicine movies too much. So we do connect particularly with the section editors. I would say though that also when a reader opens editors, walks in or whatever, you expect a certain consistency. So if there's, some aspect that is very different in one section compared to another, it might feel like it's not all the same book. Mm-hmm. And so we worked hard to try and find the balance between changing things so that they're uniform-ish and at the same time giving the freedom of expression that everybody wants when they write their own stuff.
Um, what have been some of the biggest challenges you've faced during the editing process, and how did you tackle them?
So I think it's like any other project, it seems very straightforward when you propose it and you have a timeline. We're at point A, we need to get to point Z, and it's going to be, like this is the line, this is the alphabet. And then chaos ensues, right? So people have health problems, uh, geographic and like climate and political things happen. Uh, but especially health and personal stuff. Uh, those are all real world issues. So how do you overcome them? I think for me, what has worked best is to recognize that that happens and to find out. Like, there's no question the book has to publish. So an author who agrees to do the work and then suddenly can't. We need to figure out a solution. We're not just going to eliminate that chapter from the book to find some. And so I think it's exactly like clients. Uh, Having a sense of we're going to figure this out together. There might not be the perfect solution, but let's find the least bad one. I think people appreciate that. At least it's my experience.
And how long does it take to make, for example, the last edition of Messengers?
3 years.
3 years of how many hours?
Uh,
Is it possible to put a number on that? How many hours a week did you dedicate to that?
so it's not just me, right? And
Yeah.
it's not the three. So Steve, Ed, and I divided the book three ways in terms of primary responsibility for corresponding with section editors. Then I'm the editor-in-chief designate, they both said, "This is my last edition." So Etienne, you're taking over. So I read every chapter. So when it's divided three ways like that, our first responsibility was to contact section editors and authors. Uh, that is deciding on the table of contents. So choosing with the section editors, like, okay, this section, like, here's what it's been in the past. Do these chapters still accurately represent the total of what somebody would want to know about cardiology? Maybe not. Maybe this aspect has grown and this other one is much less. And so I'll give you an example. Last edition, we introduced a whole new section called minimally invasive interventional therapies. I mean, it didn't exist. So we first have to conceive of it. That's about 6 months. Getting the section editors to help us decide what do we want the content to be, and then start to invite authors. And then typically authors, it's about a 6 to 9 month period of time that is given for authors to bring their material. A little bit longer for the bigger chapters. I mean, there's some chapters where the Word document is 100, 150 pages, and every sentence is quoted, hundreds of references, like it's a pivotal chapter. And then others are quite short. So anyway, somewhere in the 6 to 9 month window is the amount of time it takes for writing the stuff. So then that comes back. So if we think of 6 months for conceiving it, and then 6 to 9 months for creating it, we're now at about a year and that year and a quarter for sure actually took a year and a half and 2 years. Like, that's what we set out for it to be, but then something happened and this and that and whatever. Personnel changes at the publisher. We are in zero control of what happens at the publisher, and if there's a problem, we have to restart or whatever. So anyway, so that first year for us took about a year and a half, a year and 3/4. So now we have manuscript. We have to read it. So it's about around 8 to 9,000 pages, right? Word document. And so what it says in chapter this has to be at least consistent with what it says 114 chapters earlier on the same topic. So the reading takes a lot of time. But once that's done, then it's shipped to the publisher. A lot of correspondence happens with the authors during that time. I think one of my favorite aspects of creating a textbook with so many authors is to be able to learn and to understand. Um, you know, when I write something, it's crystal clear to me, but anybody else reads it and they're like, "You said this, but does it mean A or B?" And I think, I assumed that everybody would think, so we have to massage it so that it makes sense to everybody. That requires back and forth with authors, 300 plus authors, so that takes a lot of time. So overall, I would say, like, the sheer creation of the manuscript, the images, there's many hundreds of photographs, 756 videos, all of that stuff takes about a year and a half, maybe 2 years. Mm. And then off goes to the publishers, and they create page proofs. So they make the PDF version that looks like the final version. So it goes straight from the manuscript to here's what your book would be. But the authors have to review those to make sure they agree, to identify any errors and so on. And so that takes about another half year. Mm. And then you have to read that too. So the reading time alone is about another year. I've lost track. I mean, if I had to guess, there are so many days that were 12, 14 hours. I mean, by the time it gets to be more than 10 hours, even with breaks and so on, I mean, you have to stop. But I had a 6 month sabbatical that allowed me to do most of the page proofs. But the initial manuscript is just lots and lots of time. And, I will say one last thing. I think the challenge is any of us who wants to do this probably wants to do it well. When you write your first book, I think you will, as I know you, I expect that you will have quite high expectations. I mean, when we start to feel like perfectionists, we need to change one more thing, and then just one more, it takes forever. Mm-hmm. And so one of the bigger challenges is to accept that maybe this author wrote it in a way that it's not the way I would write it, but it's good. It's okay to leave it that way. That's hard.
That's a lot of work. And who does cross reference stuff? Because when you write, for example, pulmonary fibrosis in one chapter, there's a link or just like something in parentheses for another chapter. Who does all these things?
Yeah, that's the editor in chief because that's the orchestra conductor, right? Not playing any instrument, conducting. But the section editors know within their section. But for example, in Ettinger's, I think it's part, is it 3? Is differential diagnosis. So, for example, there's a chapter on icterus. Okay. Well, there's going to be a whole bunch of chapters in the liver section, 200 plus numbered chapters that refer back to icterus. But the authors in the liver don't know about this icterus chapter. And the icterus chapter author doesn't know what the liver chapter numbers are that are relevant. So it has to be somebody who has the. So that's at the page proofs stage. So when we go through the PDFs, like fibrosis, I know that on page this or chapter this is that topic. So like that.
It's a lot of work. Um, so this question is a bit challenging. So with all these hard work, with all these hours, um, the book comes out, and 2 days later, you can find it for free as an ebook.
Right.
How do you feel about it?
Yeah. So I think I have a perspective on that I think somebody who decides to do this does not have. I work every day for stretches of time and certainly multiple times a week with the people at the publisher who are earning a living doing this and who used to have somebody else that they were able to do this with. You don't have that person anymore because the income on the book is lower and that person was let go. I know what the cost is. It's like asking somebody who does movies, how do you feel about pirated movies on YouTube? I mean, I see the cost. Somebody who is just downloading the original file and scoops it for a movie, they don't know that cost. So I feel that it is theft, it is stealing, because it's taking something usually for a reason. I've been to those websites. It's a pay a small subscription fee, and we will give some of it to charity, or for only X amount of money you can have all of this next one. None of that goes back to pay for my time, the time of the authors, the time of the editors. So I think it's probably not mean. I don't think it's done with an aggressive perspective. I think actually the opposite. It's done with a feeling of this material just exists, like it just happened, right? And so we're going to collect it and share it and do good with it by giving money to a charity organization. And I mean that's detached from reality. People who do that don't understand the cost.
For our country, the story is a bit different because because of the sanctions and everything and payment. First of all, paying for that book in our money is huge. Like its incomes are different. Um, so there are companies that do offsets, so they print out the books and like sell those books. It's a very complicated. The end user that is using that doesn't see the cost. How you do because you are in close contact with the publisher and see that this the amount of money that was not paid as a payment for the book is resulting in letting go of one of one of the technical people. What about translations? Have you seen unauthorized translations of your books?
I don't know if this is just because of the position that I'm in, but all I've seen is authorized translations.
Okay.
So maybe there are others that just get shared. Uh, just a great book for translations. I mean, it's used worldwide. So there, it's as far as I know currently, it's what I know of is our translations in Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, Chinese, Japanese, and Korean. That's what I know of currently. But there are others.
Interesting. In my country, again, there's a trend of translating sections of the book in Farsi, but it usually, because of the whole copyright thing in our country, it usually does not happen with the uh, informed consent of the author. If someone wants to do that the right way,
Yeah.
what is the right way to do that?
So that's a really good question, and I have to say I don't know if the sanctions would allow this, but the way that it's been done for those translations that I just mentioned, it's a publisher within the country where the translation will happen that has the desire. So an Italian publisher, a Brazilian publisher, Portuguese, etc. They contact the publisher of Ettinger's, which is Elsevier, and they say we would like to do a translation, and then it is negotiation. How much is that going to? And so I think almost inevitably, I don't think it's the same price everywhere. I think people take into account what the market can bear. Like you can't, charge the same price of the book everywhere. And so that takes place, and I know nothing about it. The section editors, when we agreed to do the book, part of the agreement is an Elsevier will have the right to do what it wants with translations, and then it takes place. Yeah, so it's the local, like the first publisher in Iran who identifies the people who would be responsible for the translation and gets it done and prints the book. That's how it lives on.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for being with me today. And it's a Sunday, so thank you for dedicating your weekend.
A real pleasure.